They said the room in the keeper's house had been sealed since 1882. Boards crossed the door like ribs, and a hand-painted line warned in brown varnish, "Do not enter until my great-granddaughter returns." For more than a century, the cemetery slept around it, names whitening on stones, winter peeling the paint to a whisper. In November 1995, the hinges finally moved, and a living breath fogged the dust. Inside stood a table laid for three, plates crusted with a meal that never finished. A chair leaned as if someone had just risen, and the lamp chimney wore a collar of soot. From the ceiling dangled a paper silhouette of a child cut from black card, the head neatly missing. Frost crept across the panes. Dust held the shape of fingers on the table's edge. Whoever rose from that chair never returned. The room kept its breath, and the house learned to keep a century's secret. Indiana in the 1880 seconds was a place balanced between the frontier and the industrial century ahead. Small towns pressed themselves against the lines of new railroads, while at their edges stretched the fields of family plots and the shadows of cemeteries. It was in one of these towns, not far from the Wabash River, that a modest cemetery house stood, a narrow wooden structure painted in flaking white, with its chimney always smoking in winter and its door always creaking in the wind. The caretaker, remembered in scattered county records as Samuel Redding, was not a man of stature or wealth. He was a watcher, a keeper of names carved in marble, the quiet steward of burials that the townsfolk preferred not to linger over. His life was built around routine, mending the fence, trimming weeds from the stones, digging graves in every season. Neighbors recalled him as stern, seldom smiling, yet oddly meticulous. He was said to pause at each grave, as if waiting for it to answer him. Samuel lived alone in the cemetery house. There were no children running in the yard, no wife to hang curtains or light candles. The only sound was the shovel against earth and the scratching of his pen in a ledger he kept. Yet there was one tie of family that stretched across time, a granddaughter, and through her the faint promise of a great-granddaughter, though none of them were ever seen in town. Letters sometimes arrived, bearing a faint feminine script, and afterwards Samuel would sit on the porch for hours, staring at the locked room, because at the rear of that house was a door that never opened. Behind it, nailed boards sealed the frame. The townspeople assumed it was storage, or perhaps a damaged part of the building. But Samuel gave instructions, whispered in will and testament, written on a page that carried his trembling signature: "Do not enter until my great-granddaughter returns." The phrase unsettled many. Why wait so long? Why extend the lock beyond one lifetime, beyond two, to an heir unborn? It was less a request than a warning. Life moved on around the house. By 1900, Samuel was buried among the stones he once tended. The cemetery absorbed new generations of the dead, but the house, though changing hands, always carried that sealed chamber. Some caretakers nailed new boards across it, others painted over the door in grey. But none dared to break it. Superstition is strongest in towns where death is daily work, and to disobey a gravekeeper's will seemed to invite ruin. By the 1920 seconds, the house looked weathered and half abandoned, though still occupied by whichever poor soul took the job. Families whispered to children not to look at the back windows, for a figure sometimes passed there, pale and tall, though no one lived in that wing. During the Great Depression, vandals tried to pry the lock, but fled screaming into the night, babbling about a draft that smelled of iron and candle smoke. And so decades layered over the door. Dust thickened, hinges rusted, and ivy curled around the frame. By the 1960 seconds, the town itself was shrinking. Young men left for factories in Indianapolis or Chicago, leaving their elders behind to tend the graves of Civil War veterans and influenza victims. The cemetery house became an afterthought, until the 1990 seconds brought talk of restoration. Town ledgers list the house as ordinary, yet neighbors recalled a clock that chimed at odd hours and a lamp that burned without oil. Samuel polished the plates each Sunday, then locked the door again, as if rehearsing grief. Even stray cats avoided that threshold, pausing, staring, and turning back. The floorboards remembered footsteps. It was then, in 1995, that county officials planned to stabilize the building. The sealed door became an obstacle. Preservationists argued it must be opened. Genealogists unearthed Samuel's will, and rumor spread that a descendant, a woman in her 30s, might at last have returned, answering the cryptic command. When the boards were removed and the hinges cracked, the weight of more than a century shifted. The room within had waited in silence since 1882, and what lay inside was not simply dust and decay, but a scene that seemed to have been abandoned mid-breath. When the sealed room gave way in 1995, the first reaction was disbelief. For a moment, the air inside seemed to resist being disturbed, as though the atmosphere itself had been preserved in amber. A wave of cold pressed against the intruders, sharper than the November air outside. Dust swirled like pale smoke, catching in the flashlight beams of the officials. What they saw did not fit with ordinary neglect. A table dominated the center of the space, a heavy oak piece whose legs were thick with cobweb. 3 places had been set long ago: porcelain plates, silver cutlery, a pitcher of water, now emptied into a crust of minerals. The food was unrecognizable, hardened into dark lumps, but the positions suggested that someone had once been seated there mid-meal before rising without clearing a thing. One chair remained slightly angled from the table, as though someone had stood suddenly and never returned. The strangest object drew every eye upward. From the ceiling, attached by twine, hung a paper silhouette, the cut-out form of a child in profile, dangling weightless. But the head was missing, neatly trimmed away, leaving only the outline of a neck above the shoulders. Even in the dim light, the cut was sharp, deliberate. Folk art of the late 1800s often included shadow portraits, but this mutilated figure carried no trace of charm, only menace. Local reporters flocked to the site. The newspaper in town, the Indiana Herald, ran the headline, "Room sealed, 113 years, reveals macabre scene." Photographs, though grainy, showed the dust-caked plates and the dangling paper child. Questions erupted. Who had last sat at the table? Why were the settings never disturbed? And, above all, what did the silhouette mean? Neighbors, now elderly, began to share stories. One man recalled his grandfather speaking of a burial in 1882 where Samuel Redding looked distraught, carrying not just grief but fear. Another woman said her mother remembered lights burning in the caretaker's windows long after midnight, though Samuel supposedly lived alone. Children dared one another in the 1,940 seconds to touch the sealed door, only to hear a faint tapping from within, like cutlery brushing china. Theories multiplied. Some suggested Samuel had locked away the site of a private tragedy. Perhaps his daughter or granddaughter had died at that very table, and the silhouette was a memorial, grotesque in its execution. Others believed he had interrupted some intruder or witnessed a crime too horrible to recount, choosing instead to seal the evidence and curse any who entered too soon. Historians reached for context. The 1,880 seconds were a time of mourning rituals. Families clipped hair of the deceased, displayed post-mortem photographs, or crafted memorials from paper and fabric. Yet the headless child's silhouette resisted interpretation. Why no face? Why no name? The county museum director remarked, "It is not remembrance, it is erasure." As researchers combed through the caretaker's ledgers, they found entries that grew increasingly erratic after 1882. The handwriting slanted, words scratched out, pages left blank. On one page, a line stood alone: "She will knock when the time is right." The idea of waiting for a great-granddaughter returned to the forefront. Could Samuel have foreseen an heir born decades later? Some suspected the phrase was symbolic, a way of postponing discovery indefinitely. Others whispered that Samuel's line of blood had been cursed, and only the return of kin could appease it. In the weeks following the room's opening, townsfolk reported strange disturbances. Visitors to the cemetery swore they smelled candle wax near the house. though no candles burned. One teenager said he glimpsed a child's figure in the back window, only to find the room empty. County workers found their tools misplaced, as though someone had set the table again when they looked away. And the woman who claimed to be Samuel's descendant, her presence deepened the mystery. She said little to reporters, only that her grandmother once whispered, "There is a room that waits for you." She stood before the table, and the silhouette, pale and unreadable, then turned away without explanation. By December 1995, the house was closed once more, though not resealed. Scholars debated. Paranormal groups arrived with cameras, recording audio that caught faint clinks like spoons against porcelain. Skeptics dismissed it as settling wood. Yet the question lingered. What had really happened in 1882? And why did Samuel believe only blood of his blood could open the truth? Photographs taken that first day revealed details missed by the eye. A child-sized fingerprint in the water crust, a faint ring of soot above the lamp, and a fold in the tablecloth like the impression of a small forearm. Reporters argued over whether the silhouette turned slightly between shots. One archivist swore the cut edge glinted, as if newly made, though the paper itself had yellowed. During the walkthrough, a worker coughed and claimed he tasted iron. Another thought he heard a girl laugh once, far away, before the sound knuckled into the rafters. That night the town gathered by radios, trading rumors about locked rooms and unfinished meals. By morning the cemetery road wore tracks like pilgrimage. Children pressed their noses to the chain-link fence, daring each other to say the words aloud. "The headless child is waiting." Adults lowered their voices when passing the story, yet repeated it all the same. The escalation of suspicion turned the cemetery house from forgotten outbuilding into legend, a site of pilgrimage for those who wanted to press their ears to the wood and listen for the sound of forks upon china. The closer investigators and storytellers looked at the room, the less the details aligned with ordinary explanations. What at first appeared to be a simple dinner abandoned became a carefully staged tableau, as though meant to communicate something across generations. Theories hardened into competing camps. The tragedy theory argued that Samuel Redding had lost a child in 1882. Some claimed it was his granddaughter, visiting from out of town. A sudden death by choking at the table, by fever, or even by accident with the sharp cutlery might have shattered him. In grief, he created the silhouette, cutting away the child's head to signify a life erased. Too broken to clear the table, he sealed the room to preserve the moment. The phrase, "wait for my great-granddaughter," could then be read as a desperate hope that someday someone from the same bloodline would acknowledge the loss. Yet holes punctured this account. Records of death in that year showed no young female relative under his name. No obituary mentioned a child. And if grief was the motive, why mutilate the silhouette rather than carve a normal remembrance? The ritual theory carried darker weight. Folklorists pointed to Appalachian and Midwestern superstitions of the late 19th century. In some communities, paper cuttings were believed to capture the spirit of the person portrayed. Removing the head meant removing the soul. Could Samuel have believed a child's essence was bound to that black paper, suspended from the rafters? Was the unfinished meal a kind of offering, a binding ritual to keep something in place? In that light, the command to wait until his great-granddaughter returned read less like a memorial and more like a timed release, a lock designed to open only with kin present. Paranormal enthusiasts pushed the curse theory. They retold stories of townsfolk who had tried to pry the room open in the 1930 seconds and fell ill within weeks, or of a caretaker's wife in the 1950 seconds who dreamed repeatedly of a faceless child standing by the bed. Such tales were impossible to verify, but they filled the town with dread. One local pastor declared from the pulpit, "That room was not sealed to protect it from us, but to protect us from it." The most unnerving discovery came when county archivists revisited Samuel's will. A second page surfaced, browned and fragile, with lines that seemed half poem, half warning. When the circle is unbroken, and her face is seen again, the meal shall be finished. And silence shall have an end. What did it mean for the circle to be unbroken? And whose face was promised? The words suggested a deliberate suspension, a pause in time, waiting for resolution. The woman who claimed descent from Samuel complicated matters further. Some whispered she bore an uncanny resemblance to faded daguerreotypes of a young woman once photographed at the cemetery gates in 1881. Was she the great-granddaughter foretold? She refused interviews, but a county worker overheard her whispering at the doorway, "I'm here now. You can rest." For several nights after her visit, residents swore they saw a faint glow in the window of the sealed room, as if lamplight burned once more. The climax of debate arrived in January 1996, when a paranormal research group insisted on spending a night in the room. Their recordings, played on local radio, captured hours of silence until near midnight, when a sound like a spoon striking porcelain rang clearly, followed by 3 faint knocks. Listeners across the county felt chills. Skeptics blamed shifting wood. Believers called it the voice of the child silhouette demanding its meal be completed. Skeptics later staged a reenactment with replica plates and a paper child, hoping to prove suggestion at work. Their footage looked wrong, too clean, too theatrical, missing the weary gravity of use. A retired teacher wrote that Samuel once tutored neighborhood children. If a lesson ended in accident, shame might have steered his hand. But shame does not speak in prophecy. Only fear does, and fear names a future audience. The door listened, waiting. What Samuel had intended, whether remembrance, ritual, or curse, remained beyond proof. But by then, the town no longer treated the sealed room as curiosity. It became a threshold, a place where the living and the dead might still share a table. The sense grew that Samuel's command had not been eccentricity, but prophecy. Something had waited since 1882, and once the door opened, it was not clear that it could ever be closed again. In the months after the climax of speculation, the cemetery house stood like a wound left open. Officials debated whether to reseal the room or preserve it as a historical site. Preservationists argued for keeping it accessible, a glimpse into Victorian ritual. Others insisted it was dangerous, a breach in the fabric of silence that should never have been disturbed. The county eventually placed the room under lock again, though this time with an ordinary key, not nailed boards. Yet even that gesture felt inadequate. Visitors still crept to the windows, peering through cracks. Some swore they saw movement, cutlery shifting, the silhouette swaying without wind. The supposed great-granddaughter vanished from public view. Neighbors whispered she sold her family home and left the state. To some, her silence was proof that she had completed a duty only she understood. Perhaps her presence had released the spirit Samuel meant to guard. Perhaps she carried the weight of that release with her, leaving Indiana to fade into anonymity. Journalists returned occasionally, writing features with headlines like "The Dinner That Waited a Century" or "The Paper Child of Indiana." But each article ended with the same confession. The truth remained elusive. No ledger could prove what happened at the table in 1882. No genealogy could firmly link the visitor to Samuel. And no rational account could explain the persistence of the silhouette, its black paper edges somehow unbrittled after more than a century. What lingered most was the sense of interruption. A meal never finished, a chair forever pulled back, a child without a face. These fragments resisted closure. In a world that demands explanations, the cemetery house offered only fragments of meaning, as though designed to haunt rather than to inform. Residents came to treat the tale as caution. Parents told children not to pry at locks, not to chase every mystery. Pastors wove sermons about the danger of disturbing the dead. Yet in private, many admitted fascination. What family, grief, or belief had required a lock spanning generations? Why entrust the key to a descendant unborn? And why construct a warning that almost guaranteed it would be broken? Reflection spread beyond the local. Folklorists placed the case beside other legends of stopped rooms, where time seemed to pause in service of memory or curse. In them all lay a common theme: human beings fear forgetting as much as they fear death. To seal a room is to resist oblivion, to insist that some fragment of life remain waiting. Standing at the cemetery fence today, the house looks ordinary, just another weathered structure sagging under Midwestern seasons. But those who know the story say the air feels different there, heavy with expectancy, as though the table still waits, as though the clink of porcelain might resume at any moment. Years later, caretakers leave a cup of water on the porch, a compromise with memory. Nothing changes, and that is the point. A pause held open, so we can feel time breathe. The locked room reminds us that not all mysteries are meant to be solved. Some are meant to endure, carrying dread across decades. And if you ever find yourself walking past a shuttered house, with one door stubbornly fastened against time, you may wonder whether its silence is protection or warning. If forgotten rooms and unfinished stories haunt you, don't let this tale end here. Like, share and subscribe to uncover more shadows history tried to keep sealed.